Today, we're going to take a look at how the world changed throughout the 20th century, especially looking at how it changed economically and how it changed socially. Now, we're going to break this into two separate parts. We're going to talk about the economic changes here to start with. That's going to be one video, and then we're going to watch a second video that's going to be on the social issues and how those have changed throughout the time. So starting us off here, though, we're not going to look at actually the economies, but just more how the world became more interconnected. And one of the big reasons for the world becoming more interconnected in the 20th century are these global organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations, the Universal Postal Union, the International Telecommunications Union, and the International Olympic Committee. As you already know, and we've looked at, the League of Nations and United Nations both tried to bring the world together in a common forum so that they can discuss issues that are going on. As we saw with World War I, or after World War I and with the start of World War II, the League of Nations failed in that, in trying to prevent those kind of crises from happening, while the United Nations has done an okay job in preventing World War III since it hasn't happened, but there are still wars that go on, there are still problems with human rights and everything else that they're trying to fight. So it's not perfect, but it's trying to work things out. Then you have the Universal Postal Union and telecommunications that try to connect the world better, whether it's through the mail that you send across the world or more today. It's going to be the telecommunications that, with the internet and the phone, that allows us to connect and call anyone across the world or communicate with anyone across the world instantly. And then the last kind of big organization there is the International Olympic Committee, which brings all the world's countries together for sporting events every 4 years, for summer games and for winter games. So we have those organizations that start bringing this together, and then out of these develop new organizations that really try to bring us together economically. We have several ones that just deal with money, with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which try to promote developing nations and try to improve their industrialization process, but they do this through loans, which then the developing nations have to pay back, which we'll see can be a problem for some of those developing nations as they have to repay those loans. Then you have the World Trade Organization that its goal is to create a environment of free trade between all countries of the world, and this replaced the GATT, which was just trying to stop tariffs from being around the world, and it wasn't working as effectively as the World Trade Organization is today. And we can see the World Trade Organization work out in two of our following organizations here with the European Union and NAFTA. And then one of the biggest economic institutions is the G20 group, which brings together the 20 most powerful economies and brings them together to discuss what action needs to be taken in the world, where development needs to take place, how they can all help each other out. It started out with G7, or with just 7 countries, which was called G7, and now as time's gone on, it's been bumped up to G20. This might not be entirely accurate nowadays because Russia has been kind of knocked off of it because of what's happened in Ukraine, but for the most part, we're around 20 countries that get together to discuss the world economy and how to improve it and how to improve the nations that are leading it. Now, I brought up the European Union just a few seconds ago. This is one of the major World Trade Organization kind of spin-offs. I don't know if that's actually the proper thing to say, but it kind of grows out of that idea that you want to have free trade. You don't want to have taxes between countries and regulations between countries that are near each other and trading with each other. And so the goal of the European Union was to unite the countries of originally Western Europe and then all of Europe to create a kind of United States of Europe that could rival the United States. And so this began to form in the 1950s and 60s, and then it continues up until the end of the Cold War, and today we now have 28 members as part of the European Union, and they have open borders so that if you live in France, you can move to Spain without any problem or travel between those, and there's no big deal, just like you can travel in the United States from Iowa to New York without any stoppages of going through states or anything like that, other than maybe you have to pay a few tolls here and there. One of the biggest things they've done with this, because of the open borders and the free trade, is they've created a market that unites all the European powers. And the one thing that really brings those together is the idea that they have a common currency, the euro, which is doing really well. And most all the countries follow, except for a couple like Great Britain and Sweden don't really follow it, but most of them follow it, and that helps keep them united. But at the same time, it has caused some problems. If you think about some of the debt crises that happened during the mid 2000 to 2010, so around 2007 to 2010, somewhere around there, you have crises come up in Spain, in Italy, and especially Greece, which the Greek one is still going on today. That is leading countries to think about dropping out of the European Union, or countries wanting to kick those countries out of the European Union because they're bringing them down. So that's the European Union. And in response to this, a organization was made in the Americas called NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to have free trade between their countries, allow trucking companies and everything else to go from Mexico all the way up to Canada, or from the U.S. down into Mexico to sell goods or to deliver goods. And the one really big thing that this did was that it's led to the development of Mexico along the U.S.-Mexican border, with a lot of those towns that border it having major industries invest in them from the U.S. for the cheaper manufacturing and cheaper regulations and taxes that are in Mexico. And so then they're just quickly brought across the border and spread throughout the United States. And that's one of the big things that's happened to NAFTA, or happened with NAFTA, because of its development. Now, this has also been perfect for the Mexicans because in southern Mexico, where it's very rural, they feel like they've been abandoned, and so that's led to some divisions between them and their government, and some fights that have happened, and protests. But for the most part, at least for the United States, NAFTA has been a pretty good thing. For Canada, it hasn't hurt much. In Mexico, it's helped develop that border region. The one difference, though, between NAFTA and the European Union is that this is just an economic agreement. There is no goal to make the United States of America, or, well, I guess that's us, but make us bigger and include Canada and Mexico with it. We're still going to be all our own separate countries. Now, on top of these kind of organizations that bring different regions together for trade, there are actually specific organizations throughout the world, one of the biggest ones being OPEC, that focus on just one natural resource. And OPEC is kind of the biggest one, as I said, with their focus being on petroleum, or oil. And this was created in the 1960s to unite these countries and bring them together to kind of lobby for higher oil prices and regulations on how much oil would be pumped out, how to do that, all that kind of stuff. And so countries that are involved in this are from all across the world, with the Middle East, Africa, and South America, where there are a lot of oil producing, or where there are a lot of oil reserves. And so some of these countries include Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, Libya, and their goal is to regulate the price of oil so that they can reap the most benefits from it. And this has led to some really good times for those countries when oil prices have gone higher, but it's also really hurt some of these developing countries that their only resource is oil, because when those prices go down, that means their whole economy goes down. And so right now we're actually in a period where oil prices are going down, and they're continuously going down. They're not rising, and this is really hurting countries like Nigeria and the United Arab Emirates and Venezuela that are relying on this for their main source of income. While although Saudi Arabia relies on it, they're still making plenty of it because of the amount of oil they produce and how they've started to diversify their economy a little bit more. But you have organizations like this. The big one to definitely remember is OPEC. Now, on top of countries organizing together, or coming together, you have just businesses, or you have businesses branching out and spreading in between countries. And so we have multinational corporations. This began in the 19th century, but it really explodes after World War II with the spread of companies like Ford, GM, McDonald's, fast food, British Petroleum, Sony, Coca-Cola, Nike. Think of any major organization, major company, and they are probably a multinational corporation. And most of these companies, though, are based in developed nations. So they're based in the U.S., they're based in Europe, they're based in Japan, they're based in South Korea. Some might be based in China. But there aren't a lot that are based outside of the developed nations. Developing countries have maybe a few fledgling multinational corporations, but there aren't a lot coming out of those. And so this allows multinational corporations or the developed nations to kind of dominate the global market with what they sell. And they do this by exploiting the labor in other countries. So, like Sony will have a lot of their products, although they're a South Korean company, or no, sorry, a Japanese company, they'll have their products made in China where it's a lot cheaper because there's less labor regulations on it. Their labor costs are lower. Environmental damage is not really a big deal, so there are less regulations there. So that lowers the cost of the product, and then taxation might be less in China than it is in Japan. And so by doing all that stuff, making all that stuff there, and then selling it to the rest of the world, they reap more profits than they would making everything in Japan. And by doing this, they're able to also undercut new corporations that are rising up that would challenge them, possibly from those developing nations. So this can be kind of a point of contention with the developed world versus the developing world here. And on that note of environmentalism that I just brought up, we have had a push in this era to try to kind of fix that. And it's a global push that comes from businesses, but also many organizations. And the big thing here is, if you remember, when we started the Industrial Revolution, we began something called the Anthropocene Age, which is the age of man. And so we have the power to destroy the world, or we have the power to protect it. And we're kind of doing a combination of the two right now. We have had our population increase from 1.6 to 7 billion people in 100 years, from 1900 to about 2012 when we reached 7 billion. We have used a ton of fossil fuels that have pumped a bunch of carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide and other bad greenhouse gases and just pollution into the air and into the environment. And this has led to mass extinctions of animals and has endangered many animals like the panda and the rhinos and elephants and tigers and any other major animal that you can think of that might be going extinct. We have kind of led to that because of this environmental damage we've caused by taking away natural areas, by pollution running through the streams and into rivers and killing the fish and whatever else. So we have the power to destroy, and we've done kind of a lot of that, but we also have the power to protect it in that we have national forests set up, especially in the United States. We have authors and scientists that will fight against poor practices such as the use of DDT that was outlined in the Silent Spring, which DDT was significantly harming major predators, the bird predators or raptors, and that you got problems with condors and eagles and hawks and all those not being able to have young because their eggs would be defective because of DDT. And then you have organizations rising up like green parties that fight for environmentalism in Germany, but also they're in the U.S. and they're in Britain and they're in a lot of major democracies. And you have Club Rome that also fights for environmental issues. So you have all these coming together to try to fight the problems that we are bringing up with this larger population, the use of fossil fuels and mass extinction and all those. Now, this has led to a new world that we didn't have before. We have a kind of two separate worlds. We have a developed world and a developing world, with some countries in the developing world almost becoming developed, but they have some major hurdles to overcome. First off, the world is primarily controlled by the developed nations. Nations like the United States, Britain, France, Japan, all these countries that are developed. have it controlled because they have more says in the institutions that we talked about, like the World Bank, the IMF, and all those. And so they kind of control those institutions, set up the regulations that then everyone else has to play by. And because of this, they've experienced most of the growth in the global GDP. Also, because they are able to exploit developing countries, that should say developing countries and not developed, but they're able to exploit those with those lower taxes, lower wage labors that we talked about earlier. Now, developing countries, on the other hand, have to try to get over this hurdle of the developed nations kind of controlling them or being able to strong arm them, because they have to overcome the debt that they've taken on from trying to modernize. They still are in the process of modernization. Environmentalism is now fighting against them in that the global community is saying, well, we need to limit greenhouse gases so that global warming lessens. And the developing nations go, well, what's all alternative? We don't have an alternative to use for this. We have to use these fossil fuels. And so they fight back against that, but they also fight against um, that they have to take the brunt of it, because the countries that have caused this problem are actually the developed countries, and they're going, well, no, everyone has to join in now. Well, they say, well, no, actually, you guys should be carrying the brunt of this because, well, you caused this mess. And so there's a fight over that and exactly how to fight environmentalism, where they want to try to protect their farmlands and make sure that global sea level rise doesn't affect them too much. They also fight for fair trade so that you limit those wage labor issues, you limit the environmental issues and all those in those countries where fair trade, or with those organizations that fair trade is happening with. But it's not always the case, and it's not happening everywhere. And then the last major thing that's happening in developing countries is that a lot of people are leaving because the population is growing and their economies can't sustain them. A lot of people will migrate to new countries, especially the United States and other Western developed countries, because that's where the opportunities are.